There's a very definite and obvious push towards the artificial, whether that be artificial intelligence, artificial fame, artificial education, artificial past, artificial present moments, artificial futures, artificial relationships, artificial foods, artificial disasters, artificial wars, artificial problems, artificial pandemics, artificial people. There is and has been a push towards this artificial movement for a very long time now. Much of this artificial agenda can be traced back to movements that go back hundreds and even thousands of years ago. The question is why? Because the same artificial movements and programs that are existing today existed hundreds of years ago. There's a lot of pushback towards unveiling the artificial movements from hundreds of years ago because there's going to be a responsibility and accountability from the individuals of today in reference to the artificial movements and the death and the destruction of those artificial movements that affected not only the people back then, but are still affecting us today. This is why when you bring up the subject of racism in general, it's almost like a taboo. People can't talk about it. You would think something that is so ingrained in all of the systems of power that the individuals who are speaking in reference to power, conspiracy theory, control, persecution on an individual and a mass scale, you would think that these individuals would be open to digging into the foundations of something as critical as the system of racism, white supremacy, and so on and so forth. Like, where did this come from? And it doesn't even exist only in the minds and the movements of so-called white people. But some of the heaviest pushback you're going to get is from the individuals who do not identify as white. At the core of so-called white people's fear is the fear of being left out, the fear of being left behind. Because there's some obvious differences between the 9/10 of the people of the world and the 1/10 of the individuals who identify themselves as white, but have also generated this separation between all of us for their own benefit. And even when you bring up this subject, I can see people right now saying things like, racism doesn't matter. It's not about race. There's this group of beings. There's this group of people who are beyond race that are controlling everything. Yes, I understand that. But if you're going to disassemble the entire mechanism, the entire system, you have to disassemble each piece like a cancer. If you just leave that as, oh, this is just one of those things and don't even bother looking into it, that cancer will manifest itself later on. Because just as much as there's a healing that has to go on from the people who are attacked by the system of racism, white supremacy, there's also a healing that needs to go on for the people who are the beneficiaries of that system of racism, white supremacy. And if it's just lumped into this term of, well, it's just a thing that existed back then and it doesn't exist anymore, neither one of those healing modes are going to be addressed. And largely, the individuals who are the loudest on this subject, counter to this subject, are the ones who cannot empathize or even sympathize with this information because they haven't done this research. They haven't gone to the depths of the results of Jim Crow laws. They haven't seen the images of the individuals or read the stories of the individuals who were lynched, who were enslaved and had their babies fed to alligators, who had their limbs cut off, who had their children drugged down the street by vehicles and lynched off of bridges, who were beaten, destroyed, set on fire, tortured, entire groups of people, genocided, a particular group of people going around the world and exterminating groups of people. How can we not analyze colonialism in reference to the so-called New World Order of today? How can all these individuals who are speaking in reference to there's a new world order never reference the moves or the strategy of the so-called old world order? It's all one world order. There is no separation from the world order that was taken into effect 500, 800 years ago and today. There's no separation there. So what was the mindset? What were the moves that were made back then? How are those moves relative to today? That insecurity, that racial insecurity exists. Well, it's founded mostly in this genetic recessiveness that has been scientifically proven by their own doctors. Look at the existence of spraying chemicals into the atmosphere, blocking the sun with chemtrails. Would individuals who have the relationship that so-called melanated people have with the sun, would they do anything like that? Now, I'm not saying that only so-called white people came to the conclusion that they needed to block out the sun and they're the ones that are doing this. I'm saying as a whole, as a people, if so-called racism didn't exist in reference to power overall, would there be any kind of programs designed to block out the sun, as critical as it is to our nature? And that's only one program that's directly connected to this idea of race and world movements. Chemtrails are around the world. And beyond the individuals, the people, the so-called humans, this is a war against nature. And you can read many different books on the insecurities being founded in so-called white people being at war with nature, having a kind of animosity against nature itself because of this difference between us, the recessiveness, the burning of the sun, the genetic recessiveness in reference to reproduction. And even beyond that, it's become a joke in the so-called mainstream. The reproductive organs, the difference there. They have a different relationship with nature. This is why it is very crucial to analyze our differences and to not just kick off the table the perspectives of the individuals who are saying that we need to separate ourselves. People who have been living large for hundreds and hundreds of years, generations upon generations, they will never want to separate or allow people to do things on their own because they've been so used to other people doing the work that they don't want to do. This is why the idea of equality and unity on a human scale is so heavily pushed in the New World, New Age movement, especially by so-called white people. And you're even demonized for wanting to do things by yourself. Why? It's because they're so righteous. They're so at the top of the righteousness scale of human thought and empathy that they want to unify the world. And you're so low because you want to do things on your own in your own group. Is that what it is? Because that's the same mentality that was pushed when the colonists came over to the Americas and slaughtered all the individual groups of people who were living here on their own. Not saying everything was perfect, but we had a relationship with nature that is nowhere close to what people are doing today on a grand scale. The thousands of languages that existed across the country, even in California, hundreds and hundreds of languages spoken, each group having their own. And they tell you, oh, isn't it good that we've unified? Everybody's speaking English and being forced to speak English. Convert that language to the perspective of spells. People speaking the same magic, the same spells of one group of people and not their own. That's two different energetic perspectives. The perspective of not speaking your own magic, not speaking your own language, and the perspective of speaking or emphasizing somebody else's language. It changes your entire energetic makeup, not for your benefit, but for the benefit of the individuals that you are speaking that magic of. And the way they have promoted it, the way they have sold it to you through the mainstream media of the past, the present, and tomorrow, the way they have spoken it, the way they have sold it to you in the past, in the present, and for the future is that, oh, one language. This is unifying us. No, change the perspective. You have destroyed our magic. You have separated our people. You have dumbed down the relationship that we have. Our magic languages, spoke of ways, emphasized relationships that we have with each other and the land that English has no way of expanding upon, has no way of expressing ever. That attack on language and everything that has happened as a result of that can be emphasized, can be seen even more so with the attack on culture. See, in controlling the dialogue, in controlling the narrative, we have been forced to believe all of the storylines that have been pushed onto us. This is not to push blame on anybody. This is only to emphasize the storylines that are not being shared, the storylines that are being censored. This kind of double back storyline of we're doing this for your benefit, but it's really for your... This shit just happened just recently. An example of this happened recently with the so-called Facebook whistleblower. A blonde-haired, blue-eyed, so-called white woman supposedly breaks ranks with the superpower of Facebook. And to make it more real, they supposedly had their servers go down. But she breaks ranks with Facebook only to say that Facebook is censoring information, not the information that we're talking about, is censoring information that could be beneficial to the health and welfare of the people so they can make a profit. What kind of information are they saying is beneficial? What did she say? She's not talking about the information that we're talking about in our circles. She's talking about the information that the establishment itself is wanting to push in order to get people on board with the programs that they're pushing. So they had their own paid whistleblower. Then they put it on 60 Minutes and CNN to make it look more real. What happens to real whistleblowers? Do they go on CNN or 60 Minutes? No. They have to run from the government. Look at Julian Assange and Snowden. They're awaiting trials by the system that they are whistleblowing against. This is a Punch and Judy show. This is a mainstream television show. And they use something, a controlled opposition. They use something that was really beneficial to us, whistleblowing, for their own benefit. Very, very smart to use this mechanism. The same way they use what's going on with the shot to get you to push for more control. The same way they use the so-called war on terrorism to get you to push and legislate and vote for more control, more power. So they want Facebook to not censor the information that is going to be beneficial for the health and welfare of our people. They want them to censor the information that is going to be dangerous for the health and welfare of our people. So they don't want them to stop censorship. They just want them to censor the right information from their perspective, not ours. And they already have the bad guy out there, like I've said in previous videos. The sensational information, the Trump information. They knew it was going to get more clicks, so they pushed that to the top so they would get more money, more profit. While the other information by the liberals, by the progressives, it was hidden. It was censored. And they knew that they weren't going to get a big profit off of that, so they put it on the back burner while the sensational information was promoted. And everybody's going to say, yeah, shame on you, Facebook. So we already know the government owns Facebook. So now we're looking at the government to persecute Facebook because a whistleblower from Facebook came out and said something about Facebook. So they're supposed to be held accountable by the government that owns them. That's no different than the so-called police officers holding themselves accountable for the crimes they commit against the people. It's the same story. Oh, we're going to do an internal investigation. I bet you will. So this system of artificiality, this system of artificial truth, artificial education, artificial knowledge, artificial culture, artificial progress, artificial science, it all has to be pushed by not only the group of people who are behind the scenes, who are doing it. See, back in the day when they had racism as the center of power, they could just say, well, these brown people are just clearly primitive. And because they're brown, you should go over there and destroy them and just take their land because they're primitive. They're savage. They are a threat to the evolutionary movement of humanity. So you should just send your ships over there to poison them with biochemical warfare, set their homes on fire, decapitate them, feed them to alligators, kick their heads off of their babies, rape them, put your blood, your babies inside of them, breed them out of existence, genocide them out of existence, because the Darwinian model is true. The people in power today are the evolutionary peak of so-called humanity. And the people who represent an older version of humanity need to be destroyed in order for the new version of humanity to move forward. We decide what the evolution of humanity is. It's not about having a relationship with nature and each other and living a simple existence on that level. It's about how much you can control, how far you can spread your genetic material by any means necessary. They follow this path. And when you look at their model of what the evolutionary peak of humanity is, by example, they're telling you the ones who focus on war, death, and destruction in order to control resources and land masses and people, the aggressive, barbaric, deadly, that is the peak of humanity intellectually. Is that true? No, that kind of existence is an example of a recessiveness. It's not the peak. So they have to hide it and emphasize that it is the peak. Having a holistic relationship with nature, with each other, being able to communicate without war, that's a higher form of existence. That's a higher form of evolution. But that's not what's being taught. That's not what we're seeing. That's not what we're being showed as the evolutionary peak of our existence. That's not what's being put in the books. The books are being cooked for you to believe that. To believe that war brings peace. The barbaric versions of humanity are in fact the evolutionary crown of our existence. It's not true. And they're saying, see, look, they just let us destroy them. They must be inferior. They must be primitive. They must be savage. No, that is gaslighting at its highest form. To accept this system, to accept that so-called education, to accept those perspectives is sick. This is why the subject of race is such a big deal, because it gets to the core of these so-called New World agendas. Not saying it's limited to only race, but saying that it sits at the core of both what happened in the past and what's happening in the present moment and what's being pushed for the future. So they can't sell this story on their own. This story has to be sold by your own people. So the mainstream movement has to put people who look like you, who act like you, to a certain degree in your face, in your governments, in order to sell the deepest agendas. These individuals are specifically picked to look a certain way, to speak a certain way, and if they don't abide by the storyline that they have been bought and sold for, they will be removed, they will be dismissed, they will be smashed, they will be canceled. Part of this agenda, they also get people who are not necessarily representative of the full potential of your people. Look in Hollywood. Some of the so-called not white actors out there are chosen and placed up on the higher peaks of that mainstream agenda specifically because they're not necessarily that talented, as a means to maintain that primitive or savage or less than identity. So you have the Grammys and the Oscars, just even having the storyline of not having enough so-called black people being nominated for Oscars. That's the story. That's what needs to be. It's not about the individuals. It's about the storyline that exists in the people who are saying, well, they're just not that talented. They're not good actors. I mean, they can't play leadership roles, so we have to put so-called white actors. We have to put our actors out there to act as the princes and kings and queens of their lands. Why? Because they can't hold a leading role like us. Your so-called black comedians, their movies are not on the same level as other movies overall. Your characters are not on the same level as their characters. Your acting skills are not on the same level as their acting skills. Is this because you're just not as talented as them? No, they are chosen to be that way. Those scripts are chosen to be that way. Other scripts are thrown out. Just the same way as you always see slave stories pushed instead of the real history of the kingdoms of our past. It's to emphasize a mentality. So these people who are just talented up to a certain degree, who are not representative of the whole, they are put up there to set the tone for this sense of artificial equality. Equality to a point, but who's always going to be just a smidge, just a click more intelligent, better? Obviously, it's us. We control all of the studios. We control all of the production companies. We have the best actors and actresses, the most beautiful men and women of the world. Look at your supermodels. We have the most intelligent people of the world. After they've stolen all of our inventions, patented all of our shit, placed themselves on the pedestal by stepping on our backs to get there, and then telling that story over and over and over again of how they are better, because they know as the story gets told over and over again, repetition is what's going to write the books. So just as the books of the mainstream media in Hollywood are cooked constantly, showing you this bastardized version of equality with an asterisk. In order to bring that level of equality down, they have to poison the food. They have to poison the water, fluoridate your water, put poison in the skies, remove the education, remove the history, tell history from a certain perspective. Back in the day, in order to emphasize the athletic and intellectual dominance of the so-called white people, they didn't even allow us to play their sports. So they crowned their king, like Babe Ruth was crowned the king of baseball. Even still to this day, this bullshit storyline is told every day as the king, the Sultan of SWAT, the king of Crash, Babe Ruth, while he was playing in a league that is incomparable to the leagues of today, not even allowing our people to play in their league. So they cook the books, cook the numbers, let him get all the way to the top, and then when he's done, then they put everybody else in there. But by then, they had already put him as the king of the world. So basically, so-called white people are just like the Babe Ruth of humanity. They cook the books to put them at the top, to have this sort of artificial dominance over everybody. It's like shooting for the moon, and if you miss, you'll fall amongst the stars. So they have this sense of artificial dominance, but they know they're going to miss because that's not true. And their falling amongst the stars is this idea of equality. Let me say that again. This idea of higher than thou, dominance in everything across the board, athletic ability, war, leadership, anything that's held to a high esteem in reference to the human storyline. So-called white people have injected themselves at the top of that with their so-called Nobel Peace Prizes, their awards, their patents, all of their stolen inventions, even their perspectives of what is a higher intellect. They've injected themselves into that space to have this sense of dominance, genetic dominance, to hide the insecurity of genetic recessiveness, as a means to have subconsciously and in many ways consciously this idea of them being the moon and shooting for the moon. But when they are revealed for these storylines, when they fall, what is their fallback? This idea of equality. We are all equal. We are all human. There is no difference. Because when we become equal, you will still need leaders. You will still need somebody to push the movement of this now equal human race somewhere. And who will we be used to as leading everybody? Well, obviously the people who have been shooting for the moon for the last 500 years, who have been representative of the kings and queens for the last 500 plus years. So when we become equal, they will still be ruling over all of us. And beyond the race at this point, so-called white people were just used as pawns, as tools. Racism in general was just used as a mechanism to create this story. It's not about the race. At this point, it's not about race anymore. Just like it's not about so-called white people anymore. They don't need you anymore. It's about the story of power. That story of shooting for the moon and falling among the stars. That's what is needed now. Because once this new age, new world equality mind frame exists, then the people who have been in power and in control of all of these narratives for so long can just remain hidden behind the scenes, pushing the buttons of what the next agenda should be, of what the next moves of our reality should be. Race and racism overall is played out. It doesn't have as much power as it used to. It only had that power in the past because people were convinced and bought into the idea of being primitive and savage. So they went along with it and called themselves settlers. They were doing God's work. They were pushing the agenda of humanity. At that time, it wasn't equality. They were pushing this idea of a more evolved humanity. Today, that more evolved humanity is now this idea of equality, because equality is now a more evolved thought process. We already had that thought process before we were attacked, murdered, genocide, slaughtered. So now, once again, they are telling the storyline that we already had as a core, as a center for who and what we are and were. They're telling it from their perspective, in their voice, in their language, as their magic, as if they're coming up with it. And the New Age agenda is being used to tell that storyline. This is why the New Age agenda is so heavily centered on this idea of we're all human, we're all one. It's all about love and unity in the moment and all these laws of attraction and whatever it is. Like they came up with this shit. And if you don't think and act like them, follow the teachers and belief systems that they follow, then you're an enemy. You're an enemy of the evolution of humanity. You're primitive and savage. It's history repeating itself. You're a primitive and savage beast. If you don't want equality, if you don't want peace on earth, how dare you want to separate? How dare you? Like that Greta Thunberg. How dare you? How dare you? They even use kids to sell this storyline. Who the fuck is a Greta Thunberg? How dare you? You can see the climate change is going on. How dare you? This is my future. How dare you? Shut up. Sit your ass down. It's not her. They put her ass out there. It's these artificial ass people, artificial leaders. Is she out there to be a leader? Or is she out there to push shame and guilt onto you? Because she's a child. These people don't give a fuck. They will do anything. They don't give a fuck. So in order to hide not only the history, but the lengths of shit that they will go to, they have to push this identity of being the protagonist out there so much. So this is why you have your superheroes who are mostly all so-called white people. You have your kings and queens of Egypt in Africa who are so-called white people. Your teachers in the inner cities, 80-90% of people, children who do not identify as white, being spoken to, taught, disciplined by the teachers, the administration, largely built up of so-called white people. Your late night talk show hosts, where you get your information these days, and the boom of that new shit, your information. They're so nice. They're so quirky. They're so smart. They're so for us. They're telling us information that not even our politicians will tell us. Your referees, who controls the savage beasts of the football field, of the gladiator arena, who has to keep the peace, who has to keep the order. They even wear the black and white. Tame these savage basketball players. Personal foul. Get out of here. These 5'2" ass referees being towered over by these 6'9", 7 basketball players. And who has the power to kick them out of the game? Look at your TV anchors. Look at your football coaches. Look at your football quarterbacks. Who are the leaders of these savage beasts? Because they're more intelligent, right? That's the subconscious storyline. So-called black people are worth nothing more than their muscle mass and their savage nature. So put them on the O line, put them on the D line, make them run fast, make them jump in the air and catch the ball, and put extra ramifications for attacking the leader of the field, roughing the passer. How dare you rough the most important person on this field? 15-yard penalty, bitch. So the so-called white male has to be put out there as this nice, funny, sweet, smart, for the people, an educator. Why? To hide the past, to hide the history. That's the storyline that's being sold. While equal to that, you have the most beautiful women of the world. What do they look like? Well, in order to emphasize that, put a Miss Universe pageant out there. Put a Miss America and get the whole world involved so it doesn't look like it's just us pushing this agenda. But everybody's involved. Everybody loves it. Everybody can vote. But overall, who's going to be the most beautiful one, right? The one who has the most so-called white features. Before that, they were just blatant about it. It's just going to be only white people, only white women. Beautiful. They still do it today. Put them on the cover of magazines, the most beautiful man and woman of the world. No different than the Barbie doll, your Jackie Kennedys, your Ellen DeGeneres. So sweet, so nice, so intelligent, so forward thinking. While our women are seen as what? Mean, unapproachable, harsh, angry. That's the atmosphere that's put out for our women, for our men. And then when you even bring up this reality, those are mainstream facts. Everything that I've said in this video is a mainstream fact. To even bring up this information is a threat. When you bring it up, they'll hit you with the guilt. There are going to be people in the live chat right now, in the comment section later on, going hard. Oh, he's caught up on race. Oh, racism is being used by the system to separate and divide us. You're just caught up in the old storyline. Da 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 da. That same shit's being sold over and over and over again. Whether it's paid bots selling those comments or bots of the NPCs who are just not even aware, who can't empathize with this information because they just are believing in their own equality storyline and not wanting to look at this information. You can't move forward with two broken legs. You can't move forward with this cancer festering inside of you. The work needs to be done. These wounds need to be healed. You close the book without finishing the book, without reading the first chapters of the book, you're not going to know the full storyline. You just want to move on to the next story? Don't work like that. So you'll be hit with the guilt. You'll be hit with the shame. I've been speaking on this for over 10 years now. This channel's been hit with the guilt, hit with the shame, hit with the censorship. Even bringing this information up, they have algorithms to hide this information. And even the act of guilting and shaming you and censoring you is a form of gaslighting, as if you shouldn't even be speaking about this information. So these individuals are just examples. They're just manifestations of the system itself. This is why it's not to be taken seriously. I know what gaslighting looks like. I know what it sounds like. I know what it feels like. And beyond that, why are these individuals so concerned about what you speak about? Largely, it's going to affect their power, their control, their dominance over you, their creature comforts. And like I said earlier, because you have individuals who look like you, who are also speaking against bringing these storylines up, or not bringing these storylines up, who are in fact downplaying these storylines, because those individuals who look like you are doing that, they are a part of that gaslighting operation. This movement towards a so-called New World Order, you have to realize that it's not new. It's old. It's very old. And there's a science, there's a technique that was used. There's a timeline that was used to get through that old control up until the new control of today. If you don't analyze and understand and break down the techniques that were used back then, you're not going to understand and see to the full spectrum of the techniques that are being used today. So just washing it away like, oh, race doesn't exist, racism doesn't matter, you're buying into the storyline, it's all about equality. These are just lullabies being used to make people deal with the gaps that are in their understanding of the overall storyline. Imagine being in like the 1700s and having some so-called white people come up to you and say, you know what? Racism really doesn't matter. We're all enslaved. Stop being a victim. It's not white people. It's just a few of the people at the top. As your people are being enslaved, your babies are being fed to alligators, as entire millions of people are being genocided. It's not about your people. It's not about race. We're all slaves. We've all been enslaved. The origin of the word slaves comes from the Slavic people. The Slavic people didn't have Jim Crow law. Quit trying to say, oh yeah, like push. Instead of pushing the storyline off of your ancestors, try to identify where we're coming from. You need to heal as well. They have to downplay, they have to dismiss your storyline in order to maintain this idea of forward progress of humanity. At the core, these so-called white people, Europeans, are not American. They are the ultimate immigrant to this nation, just for example purpose, just from this nation. That story has to be just washed over as if, oh yeah, well, it just happened, so just get over it. That's basically what they're saying when you say, racism doesn't matter, it's not about race. Hold on a second. All of the land, all of the resources sitting at the foundation of the most powerful, the superpower of this so-called New World Order, the beginnings of the power dynamic of these individuals, comes from a stealing of a land, a genociding of a people, a manipulating of a psychology, a developing of all these backward ass belief systems involving religion, so-called science, cosmology, history being destroyed, books being burned, all relating to so-called racism. And that doesn't matter because all races have been enslaved. All people, get the fuck out of here. That's a tired and weak ass argument. And it's just repetitive and garbage. Yes, there are the few at the top, beyond race, that are pushing certain agendas. Yes. Does that take away from how race was used to enslave entire nations of people, to genocide entire nations of people, to steal entire nations of land, to poison entire nations of people? Just because that exists, those few people at the top who are enslaving everybody today, for people who only want the storyline to go so far, that's all they need to know. And for people who are trying to protect their creature comforts, their connections to this stolen identity, they have to put out those perspectives. So you will not unveil the crimes that they have committed and the crimes that their people are still committing to this day. That gaslighting operation needs to be in full force. You primitive and savage beasts can't go out here asking questions about what our ancestors did. How dare you? You need to repeat what's been told to you. Repeat this. All people are enslaved. The first slaves of the world were the Slavics. That's where the word slave comes from. So you don't need to be telling me about no Jim Crow. We were there first. We were enslaved first. Okay. The Slavic people might have been the first enslaved, but the peak of intellectual slavery, the highest form of slavery, didn't exist with the Slavs. It exists with Jim Crow. It exists still to this day. We're not talking about the origins of slavery. We're talking about the peak of slavery. Psychological enslavement is the peak of enslavement, is the peak of slavery, dealing with all people. No, it was peaked out. It was maxed out with a particular so-called race of people at the center, at the core of so-called racism. Understanding and pointing out the peak of enslavement, physical and psychological, pointing that out, identifying it as the system of racism, white supremacy, isn't to push blame on white people. It's to identify the peak and everything that stems out from that peak, from that core, as a means to understand it, to heal from it, and move forward. So when people are telling you, oh, we're all enslaved, the Slavs were the first slaves, they're coming at you as if you're coming at them with blame. It's downplaying the overall storyline. It's dismissing where you're really coming from. Do not allow this shit to happen. Don't allow them to control the narrative. When they're telling you it's the Slavs that were first, when they're telling you we're all enslaved, they're telling you that to dismiss your perspective, to control the narrative. It's a gaslighting operation. And a lot of these people don't even know they're doing it. That's the most complex form of enslavement. To have people fight your war and they don't even know that they're fighting. They think they're fighting against you, but they're really fighting for you. That is the highest form of enslavement. So in closing, like I said, in order to hide these insecurities, in order to hide these dismissive, controlling the narrative mechanisms, there has to be a positive and a negative storyline that has to be pushed and emphasized over and over again in order to avoid taking responsibility for what has happened and what is still happening. So they push equality, push and promote both positive and negative, whether it's war and colonizing, or going to the moon and fighting climate change or killer asteroids. Whatever it is, it has the same effect on the individuals, controlling the narrative and buying into their leadership. And as they control the narrative, they're injecting themselves into the overall storyline as the leaders of all storylines. And like I said, once you break down and point out that they are not the leaders of the moon, they are not the highest peak of the evolution of the moon, they will fall amongst the stars of equality. And once we're all equal, once all the dust settles, they will work their way back up to being in control again and being in power again and pushing the storyline into deeper control again. And that's not to say that this equality space is like, oh, something's going to happen and we're going to be all equal. No, it's not to say that. It's to say that when that identity, when that belief that things are getting better, things are changing, we're becoming one. No, you're becoming more enslaved under a new identity. This system needs to be fully addressed and undressed. And in that undressing of the past, the present, and the idea of the future, you'll realize that this system overall, in its naked form, is sick, empty. There's nothing left. There never was anything there for you. It was only the artificial version of being for you. Once you strip it down, you'll realize there's nothing left for you. We, the people who are not the beneficiaries of any of this system's work, who are in fact attacked by these establishments. We've been knowing this already. We know. We've been seeing how naked it is. We've been seeing how jacked up these systems are. We never thought that these systems were ever for us. There's a particular group of people who believe that these systems were for them. This is another example of the peak of enslavement. We were aware of it. At one time, your people were in celebration of this. We never celebrated this establishment. Never. There's only one group of people who celebrated this storyline, this movement, so-called progression of humanity. There's only one group of people on the whole world. And it's not us. And now, simply because they don't want to celebrate it anymore, now we should all just come together and just forget everything that happened? Get the fuck out of here. It don't work like that. And you're not going to gaslight me for bringing up what's really going on just because you're new to this information. So once there's nothing left, once you've stripped it down, you'll realize there's nothing left to hold on to. Never was anything to hold on to. And we are valid in our wanting to move on away from these systems, away from these establishments. And in many cases, away from certain people who are still holding on to that cancer, who are still holding on to those beliefs. There's nothing wrong from wanting to separate yourself from sick people. Especially sick people who are not aware that they are sick. They are contagious. They're the most contagious, the ones who are not aware that they are sick. It is not wrong to want to separate yourself from people like that. Do not be convinced that it is wrong to separate yourself from those people. The leaders who have spoke about this separation were assassinated, were taken out. These individuals largely who are talking about this broad spectrum approach of equality and all this other new age bullshit are talking about letting the wolf come sleep in the house with all the sheep because we're all equal. As a wolf and a sheep, we're all the same. No, I don't. You ain't seeing the same storyline we're seeing. And just because we see it that way doesn't make us wrong, doesn't make us lower than you. It doesn't make us angry. It doesn't make us a part of some bigger storyline of wanting to usher in this communist control grid. No, we are aware of the actions of certain people, and we are choosing to not be a part of that, choosing to not be around any of that. And there's nothing wrong with that. Our history has been redacted, has been manipulated, removed, while other history has been glorified, emphasized. We are aware of the controlling of the narrative and the power that comes from that. We won't allow it to happen anymore. The storytellers are waking up, and we will continue to tell the stories that we have experienced and tell the stories that will empower our people until we can't tell them anymore.